Tonight, Israel's bill to tax heavily foreign NGOs receives international and local condemnation. The bill is being dubbed as a civil society killer, and Canada will send an additional funding of $58.1 million to the Horn of Africa to provide food assistance and medical supplies. From the vaults, how low-income Canadians are more susceptible to falling victim to the opioid crisis. A rebroadcast of an interview by Saamiyah Syed.
Unfortunately, Indigenous population is at a very high risk.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I'm Catherine Bullock, sitting in for Saamiyah Syed. Human rights advocates are criticising the draft of a bill in Israel. The bill, if passed, will impose heavy tax on foreign government donations to Israeli and Palestinian civil society organisations. The bill consists of two main components. The first redefines what a public institution is. Not only will the bill impose tax on them, it will have the effect of stopping them from appealing to the court. Critics say this amendment targets human rights organisations that advocate on behalf of Palestinians and are funded by foreign governments. The second part of the bill will tax donations that are thought to interfere with the internal affairs of the State of Israel. The tax rate will be 65% without any right to exemption or reduction. There has been fierce criticism from Israel's closest allies, including the US, France, and Germany. It is also receiving local condemnation. The bill has been a legislative priority of Benjamin Netanyahu's government. However, after receiving backlash, the government may postpone presenting it on Sunday. Canada has announced an additional $58.1 million in funding for the drought-stricken Horn of Africa. The government has issued a statement saying funding will be allocated to UN agencies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and other non-governmental organisations. The money will be used to provide the most vulnerable communities with food, healthcare, safe water, and sanitation. Canada will also support the logistics of the humanitarian response in both Ethiopia and Somalia. The additional aid brings Canada's total humanitarian funding this year for the region to over $98 million. The Horn of Africa is experiencing its worst drought ever recorded. It has had below average rainfall for over 2 years, affecting at least 43 million people. Even in areas where rain has recently fallen, the ground cannot absorb it due to drought. This is leading to devastating flash floods. A UK watchdog says 5 major banks have potentially violated competition laws. They have been engaging in the unlawful exchange of sensitive information regarding British government bond trading through online chat rooms. One of them is a Canadian bank. The watchdog says the alleged behaviour occurred at various times between 2009 and 2013 by Citi, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, and the Royal Bank of Canada. The banks are accused of sharing pricing information and trading strategies through chat rooms on Bloomberg terminals. The watchdog says the improper information exchange could have hindered the fair competition for products. It could also have deprived taxpayers, savers, and other financial institutions of rightful benefits. The Executive Director of Enforcement of the watchdog says the alleged activities are very serious as they threaten the UK's reputation as a global financial hub. He said Deutsche Bank and Citi have admitted their involvement in anti-competitive conduct. However, he said the Royal Bank of Canada, HSBC, and Morgan Stanley have not admitted any wrongdoing. He said the watchdog will consider further submissions from the parties before reaching a final decision. Please stay tuned. We will be back after a short break.
Now, a recent study has found that opioid harms have reached a crisis level. This study looked at opioid deaths across 17 years and noticed that low-income Canadians were nearly 4 times more likely to die from opioids. To give us more details on the study is Professor Wasim Al-Sabah, a pharmacy professor at the University of Waterloo and the lead author of the study. Welcome to the show, Professor. It's great to have you join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brother Wasim, can you tell us more about your study? What exactly were you looking at?
So we know that opioids harms, that includes death as a result of overdose, going to the hospital and going to the ER, affects every Canadian. It is a crisis that we are living in right now. However, what we looked at the areas in Canada divided by the income level, and we looked at the number and rate of those opioids harms and to see if there is any difference by the area income level. And we found that Canadians who live in the low income areas have almost 4 times the mortality rate, the hospitalization rate, and almost 5 times the number of ER visits as a result of opioids overdose.
Mm-hmm. Now, based on these statistics, what trends did you notice across them?
Well, we found that the gap was reducing over time for mortality. So in the most recent year in the study, we found that it's almost 2.5 times. Still, it's a big inequity in terms of the effect of the opioid harms. For the hospital visits and ER visits, we found that there was no change. The inequity was stable. The most recent year was 2012 that we have data for, and we found that it's still about 4 to 5 times the rate in low-income areas in comparison to high-income areas.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've given us a lot of statistics here, but if we try to translate this into explanations, what does this gap for low-income Canadians' prevalence in opioid deaths mean or even suggest?
Well, we know that no one is immune against having an opioid harm. No matter who you are, where you live, what kind of family you grew up in, what type of education you have, everybody is prone to this crisis. However, those who are living in low-income areas look like they are more vulnerable to those effects. This might be a result of having less accessibility to material aspects, for example, affordable housing, stable economic opportunities. In addition, it might also represent lower access to social support. So somebody to lean on if you have a stressful situation in your life, somebody who you can look up in the time of difficulties, somebody who check up on you. So it cannot be only about material aspects. It must be also taken into account the social aspects of the crisis. So both having sufficient material means as well as the social capital, meaning people to support you.
Mm-hmm. Now, from what I understand, it is also minority groups like Indigenous groups that exist within this low-income bracket. Can you give us some more details for this?
Unfortunately, Indigenous population is at a very high risk of opioids harms. For example, we know that the Indigenous population represents almost 2.6% of the Canadian population. However, their mortality is almost 10% of all opioids harms, which means it's almost 4 to 5 times the rate among the Indigenous population as opposed to the overall Canadian population. This might be a result of intergenerational trauma. It might be a result of racism, discrimination, lack of economic opportunity. All those working together, all those factors together make the Indigenous population more prone to those harms. And unfortunately, a lot of people are losing their lives as a result of this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've highlighted the problem, you've analyzed the effect, but what are some ways to address these trends that you found in your study?
Well, we are hoping that our study will enlighten policymakers in their designing of new interventions, new ways to tackle the opioid crisis. That might include multidisciplinary teams that work together, that has both medical professionals and social workers to work together, so the opioid crisis can be tackled from the roots of it. In addition, the places where those programs should be implemented should be close to where people are at the higher risk. So, for example, the inner city areas, the low-income areas, those are the areas that we are hoping that policymakers will take into account to implement those programs, so they have higher accessibility to people. Because let's remember that people with low income have lesser access to vehicles, for example, so they will more depend on public transit. So those programs should be accessible. It should be more understanding of the cultural sensitivities. So when we talk about the Aboriginal population, community leaders should be consulted, should be involved meaningfully to have appropriate interventions to work with the people to get this crisis under control.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've highlighted some areas where your study findings can be used to appropriately address the issue. But do you think our current healthcare system is appropriately equipped to handle this issue?
Well, there are a lot of interventions that have been made already. So there are, for example, the antidote that is being distributed free of charge in pharmacies across Ontario, for example, and in other provinces as well. There are also the controlling of prescribing. So physicians and nurse practitioners are more educated now about how to appropriately prescribe those medications for the people who need it. So I think that we are starting to do some interventions, but we still have a long way ahead of us, especially after what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic that actually made the opioid crisis even worse.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember when there was elections in a local riding close by, there was a candidate that was pushing for a health and addiction center. However, the proposal was wildly unpopular, and ultimately, not only was the candidate not elected, there's no center. Now, I know that this is the case for only one local riding, but it suggests that there is a little reluctance to build these kind of centers that end up helping people. Now, you mentioned that there is a social aspect to this issue. How do you think this relates to the idea of building centers?
I think harm reduction idea is essential to be used as a tool in this fight against the opioid crisis. Harm reduction can have programs such as the safe injection sites, where people have access to clean needles, and also can contain what we call safe supply programs. Safe supply programs means that we provide people who use drugs with medically prescribed clean supply, so they don't have to go to purchase the illicit supply that is usually contaminated, and it's usually the cause of the overdose death. Now, we can only talk about evidence, what the evidence tells us. Those programs are actually very effective in saving lives and saving the healthcare system that we all care about. We know that how much it's stretched right now. So I think we should try our best to gain the minds and hearts of our population that those programs are effective, they save lives, they are essential in our fight against the opioids crisis. My wife volunteers in a local organization that cares for the youth that are suffering from homelessness. She once cared for a young man who was homeless and who was also using drugs. A few weeks later, she asked, "Where is this person?" They pointed to a picture on the wall saying that he passed away as a result of an overdose. Those people should not be turned into just a picture on a wall. Those people are our sons, our brothers, our daughters. They are our people. We should care about them, and we should find every good way to care for them and prevent the needless death. And safe supply programs and other multidisciplinary programs are one of the tools that should be used to tackle this complex problem.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us and telling us more about your study and what can be done with this results. It was a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.